Today's topic is we're going to be talking about is the $2 billion migration consulting industry over, or even more specifically, are agents actually there yet? Can we do sort of large scale code migrations, large scale legacy refactoring, things like that with agents? So without further ado, let's jump into it. So my name is Lou, and as Maria mentioned, I work for a company called Ona. I'm the field CTO, and I was previously also a platform engineer. I'm very frequently at some of the platform con events, reInvent, KubeCon, etc. So you can certainly grab me there. Ona, for context, we won't talk a lot about Ona specifically today, but I do want you to understand effectively why I'm here and also talking to you about sort of agents and migrations and how that fits together. And Ona is effectively an AI software engineer. It's a platform for running AI software engineers that can operate in the background. They can perform tasks like writing code, reviewing code, all for you. And that's all scalable and orchestrated running inside your cloud account. What that effectively brings us into is this new world where potentially agents can also do large scale refactoring across our entire code estate, all of our different repositories and things like that. But what I want to do is really take apart that question and say, are agents actually there? Is AI actually there? Can we do these with the agents and the technology that we have today? So let me run you through the agenda and how I want to break this down. So what I'll do first is I will give you an introduction, a timeline of what's changed within AI 2024 to 25 and how that potentially impacts these sort of large scale migrations at companies and whether or not we can actually do them. We will go into the anatomy of an agent. I actually will do that a little bit later during one of the case studies. But then what I want to do is almost like this meta-analysis of some of these case studies. So we are going to talk about Slack. We're going to talk about Google. We're going to talk about Airbnb. I did very much want to pick almost like vendor neutral case studies here because I want to focus very much on the technology and the agent side and see are they actually capable of it rather than getting too much into the specifics of individual vendor solutions. That said, that's really difficult to do. So one of the case studies is from a vendor. It's not from Ona, but I will also talk a little bit about Ona as well to tie in with one of those case studies also from Airbnb as well. And then towards the end of the webinar, what I want to get into is also if AI is in a place where we can do migration, so what are the use cases for that? What are the important factors like human in the loop? And then also figuring out ROI. So let's say if you know, from what we talk about in the session with migrations, it seems like it would be a good fit for you, how to think about which use cases and sort of where you're going to see ROI, what size of company and things like that. So with that in mind, let's actually go ahead and get started. So obviously we have all been drowned by AI updates over the last year or two. I have certainly had many late nights this last year with all of these updates. You know, it's oftentimes very difficult to keep up. But there are, for AI agents in migrations, there are principally sort of three main areas or innovations that we have seen that have really moved things towards being able to achieve large-scale migrations. The first one is sort of context windows. You know, back in 2024, mid-2024, Gemini released some models that basically take a 1 million token context window. And what that effectively means is we can take a lot of the lines of code that we have in our repository and bundle those into a model so it has a much bigger context. When we fast forward even to today, and Anthropic and some of the other models now have much more sizable context windows, up to 1 million, but now we're also dealing with other challenges when you have such a big context window that can kind of trip up AI and agents when you're bundling so much information towards them, and it doesn't necessarily always lead to mitigations of hallucinations and things like that. The second sort of big innovation is tools use. So you pass to that model a set of instructions, be APIs, they can be logs, things like that, and then the model itself can choose whether to actually answer your question to resolve the issue, or it can even invoke one of the tools. And those tools can be literally anything. And that's how coding agents like Claude and Cursor, etc. work, because things like the command line and your logs and your source code is all integrated into the model via tool invocation. And the model is making decisions about what to use and when. And that gives us a greater amount of autonomy within agents. And that starts to beg the question, can we do more complicated tasks like code migrations? And therefore, what I would say is we have the building blocks. I think the question around migrations is less, is it possible? But it's more of a question of which type of migrations can we do? How complex are those use cases? Is it for simple things, for more complicated things? That's really sort of the essence of the question, I think, is what we have to answer. So I'm going to spoil the ending quickly before we actually get into some of the use cases, and I want to break down migrations. So I say migrations, probably everyone here has a slightly different definition of what that means, but what I want to do is break this down into a few different solution buckets. So prior to AI, without AI today, largely what we have is sort of deterministic or script-based migrations. At a primitive level, that could be taking a shell script or any type of script and just parsing through your files and transforming them as you see fit. One slightly more advanced way of doing that is through something called AST, which is abstract syntax trees, which is taking your code as it is structured inside the files, changing it into a different data structure into these syntax trees, and that allows you to traverse through it. It's quite advanced and it's something that has come out of some of the large big tech companies, but there are various different open source interpretations of this, and you can use it for what I would describe as simple syntax changes across large code bases. But it can be quite fiddly. You have to write manually how to do these transformations, and there are some open source modules for that, which is helpful. But 9 times out of 10, probably the migrations you want to run, you're going to need to do some sort of custom scripting here, and it can be quite a large investment. However, we'll come back to AST because it still does have a role within large-scale migrations today, especially with AI. And then if we shift and have a look at these 2 boxes on the right, so what we have is sort of hybrid migrations, and that means where we use LLMs, or we could use LLMs on their own, so it's not hybrid, it's just agent-based LLMs. And then we introduce AST, or we introduce this sort of deterministic script-based approach, and we have both, where we are transforming some aspects with AST, passing that to our LLM or our agent, and then using those 2 together in order to achieve transformation of our code. The final one that I want to talk about is sort of what I would describe as black box migrations. And this is where you take a service or a component, usually it's a legacy one, so it's a mainframe, maybe COBOL, something like this, where you don't really know what's going on in there. It's lived for a long time inside the organization. It's maybe written in a legacy language like COBOL, where you don't really have people in the organization that particularly understand. It probably was written, at this point, it could even be 50 years ago, and it's very difficult for you to maintain. The way that a black box migration works is then you observe the system as it's functioning. So you look at its inputs, you look at its outputs, and from that you can derive a specification. Then using that specification, then you can transform your code, make a new version of that service. Let's say you're taking COBOL, converting it into Java. You could take that from the specification and generate a new service, put that into production, and kind of phase over pieces of traffic and slowly migrate onto that. The big critical difference, I guess, between this idea of sort of LLMs and AST hybrid type migrations and black box is that with black box, you're kind of not really having so much of a human in the loop as such. You're just doing a full lift and shift. Whereas with the hybrid migrations, we are hoping that the recipients of those code changes, there are code owners that can receive those changes. We'll dig into this a little bit more because this is a little bit abstract and I have a slide a bit later, but it's these hybrid migrations where I think there is the biggest opportunity right now within the industry to adopt agents for significant benefits in our organization to migrate large amounts of legacy and these types of code. So I think the best way of actually getting into answering this question about can agents do large scale migrations is to look at a few case studies. So I've got some from Slack, from Google, from Airbnb, and then I've got also an anonymous case study from Fortune 500 Retail, which is from the vendor Mechanical Orchard. They do this kind of black box migration, so we can dive a bit more into the specifics of how that works for them. So because that black box migration is so different to some of the other types of migrations, I actually want to start there, and then we'll turn over to the other ones. So like I mentioned, what you're effectively doing here is inspecting the inputs and the outputs of a service. Maybe you're going through the documentation about the service, you're going through other information that you have, and you're doing almost like a lift and shift transformation. And you can still do that in a very incremental way, but this works when you don't really have any sort of active maintainers on that source code itself, where you want to do a lift and shift and you're okay, where you're not going to try and actually replace the existing source code as it is and recreate it in a different language or transform it in some way. The one thing that I would like to say about this type of migration is that it feels at this point it's still a productized service. What I mean by that is it feels still very much like a consulting type of workload. The reason that I say that is because there's still a lot of hands-on work that you have to do to understand your systems, to gather all this documentation, to traverse all these inputs. And there are companies like Mechanical Orchard that will do that with you. They have a very opinionated sort of approach for this, but it's not necessarily a tool that you can buy off of the shelf as such, and it's not going to become, at least in its current form, kind of a category like we might have CI/CD or the other different types of tooling that we take as staple these days. So that will apply this type of migration to some organizations, legacy organizations. It might be worth looking into. Just like this Fortune 500 retailer, they have a success case study here of actually moving from COBOL to Java, but it's using a lot of proprietary tools and using a lot of custom sort of process in order to get there. Now, I want to move into two case studies that are very similar. One's from Slack, one is from Airbnb. Ironically, they're actually doing the same migration, which is they're moving from Enzyme to React testing library. That's because Enzyme itself didn't support, I think it was React 17, which means that when you wanted to bump to React 18, you had to go through all of your different test assertions, and the only thing compatible with React 18 and beyond was React testing library. So both Slack and Airbnb then needed to go through their entire tech estate and convert this library. And this is kind of a standard migration that I think you see at a lot of organizations, whereby we just need to swap out from one package to another. We don't really want to change the structure of the tests as such. We want to keep them in place as they are, but we need to swap out some syntax. In Slack's case, they were able to do that by combining effectively this AST approach and LLMs. So by going through their code base and converting it to this AST structure, they were able to convert some of their methods. However, what they found is that didn't work for all of the different methods all throughout their code base. So what they did is take both agents plus AST and combine them together, whereby feeding, for instance, the output of those AST where it didn't work, where there's comments, etc., feeding that back into the agent and using LLMs and their sort of naturally autonomous process to then be able to start to transform some of that code. One thing that stands out in not just this case study itself, but in all of the stories, even when I talk to our own customers, etc., is that you can get to a certain percentage, in this case, like mentioned, 80% of the way, but you're still going to have to do that final push, that last 20% with human review. So, there is an asymptote and there is diminishing returns for fine-tuning that last sort of 20% of a migration. However, at scale, achieving that 80%, that initial 80% of a migration can be significantly valuable, especially if you have a large organization, especially if you're somewhere like Slack where you have 15,000 test files across probably, I would imagine, hundreds of thousands of repositories as well. So how are these companies doing this? So let's take a step back for a second, because I want to kind of break down agents. For those of you in this space for a while, this will be something that you're familiar with. For those of you who are maybe just a consumer of an agent and haven't really opened up the lid on how they work under the hood, let's actually have a look at that now. So an agent, and this is sort of an OpenAI definition, which I really like, which is breaking down the agent into these 4 different parts. So we have instructions, and I think these 2 things on the left are what we're most familiar with. We have instructions, we have our prompt that we pass into our large language model or our LLM. And that's where we talk about prompt engineering, or in this case, we also talk about context engineering. When it comes to doing a large-scale migration, one of the most important parts is actually making sure that your agent, your LLM that's actually doing the processing, has the right context. So that means passing in the right files. That might mean giving it examples. It might mean giving it the documentation of the migration that you're doing, but ultimately choosing the right files to give to the agent so that it can have enough context to perform that migration. We then obviously have the model, the LLM itself, depends on which you're using. Some, they all vary in different ways, have a lot of different behaviors. Reasoning models, large context window models, some are more expensive than others. Some have different security processes as well. But then the thing that really unlocks migrations is these 2 parts on the right-hand side, which is tools and runtime. Now, I mentioned tools a little bit before, but tools are the way that the agent can almost act with the outside world. In the case of Slack's example here, so what they did is they broke down their migration into individual steps, which meant that they were able to do those individual code transformations, but then also validate by running their test suite, running their linting, running their TypeScript compilation, and then every time they're probably going to get some form of error, feed that back into the agent, iterate, and make progress. Again, getting towards that sort of 80%, but there might be some edge cases that the agent can't fix or doesn't know how to, because they are particularly unique to that piece of code, or there's something about them that's out of the ordinary. And then the final part is the runtime. So the agent needs to run somewhere. We'll get onto this a little bit later, but there's almost like two different types of migration that you can perform with agents. One is locally, which is install, your favorite agent, Cursor, Claude Code, whatever on your machine, and then you can run those migrations. Or there are a new category of tools that now can run these migrations at scale inside of your organization. So effectively by orchestrating the agents that can run in the background and process multiple different tasks at the same time at scale. Now, of course, there are limits to that. You might not necessarily want to run migrations across your entire code estate. What you typically see is you do this over one repository, let's say transform that, iterate over a number of different more repositories, and as you gain confidence, as you start to build those edge cases, as you start to customize your prompts and your context so that your agent becomes more effective, then you can have the confidence to scale this out further and further. Now, if we move to Airbnb, somehow by some sheer fluke, they're actually doing the exact same migration. This is, I think, pure coincidence. It's not anything to do with the fact that I think models are somehow better with React or front end. I think for sure that is sometimes a little bit the case because of their training data, but this could be quite easily Java, Python, any other language, Golang, etc. But what they did in the case of Airbnb, very similar kind of situation in this part where they needed to convert from Enzyme into React. But what they did is they actually did it entirely with their agents, entirely with the LLM. What they did that was unique and somewhat similar, but a little bit more advanced than Slack, is they really broke the migration down into those discrete steps. So in a similar case, by like converting their code, running their jest, etc., but really breaking those down and making sure that the agent completed and validated each of those steps first before moving on. And again, we see a pattern which is around context engineering. Again, the stress that passing in the right files and passing in the right context is able to drive the agent's success rate up. And in their case, going from sort of 50% success rate to 75% and onwards. And then obviously, as you get higher, it gets harder and harder to achieve that. But that's where we want to swap over, just use human in the loop, just use our regular engineers to be able to do that last yard of the migration. Just to add a bit of color to this, I do want to show this because we talk about, this agent kind of going through these different steps. And if you see on the left-hand side, and actually if I go back one slide, on all of these slides, you have the link. And as Maria mentioned, we'll send you the PDF so you can follow those if you want all of the detail. Each of these case studies could be its own webinar. They're so detailed. But you can see that they break this down into sequential steps. Like I mentioned, Enzyme, Jest, linting, TypeScript, etc. The way that works inside of Ona is very much the same, whereby for these large-scale automations, you plug in these individual steps. It makes sure that each of those is complete as it goes through before at the end raising a pull request and then handing over to humans to review that, etc. And then you can loop around as well if you give feedback on the automation, then actually triggering that and rerunning through the agent steps as well. The final case study that I did want to touch on is this one from Google. Now, I don't want to get too caught up on this one in particular because what they actually did was they fine-tuned their own Gemini model. I wanted to include that because probably some people might have this question is, to do migrations in our organization, do we need to have a fine-tuned model? Now, in Google's case, yes, they did that, but that's also because they have a very strong machine learning kind of competency within the organization, very famously custom tools inside the organization. But actually the main message that I want to take away from this is you actually don't need to fine-tune specific models in order to achieve these large-scale migrations. Sure, in this case, Google did it here so that they can convert from 32 to 64-bit integers across their code base. They did leverage their Gemini model, and that is something that you could look into if you wanted to for a specific migration. However, this is a very significant investment. Training a model takes vast amounts of data. It takes a lot of time, a lot of compute, and that adds to this ROI type of equation when you're doing these migrations is if there is something very custom, you might want to consider training a model for it. but I would say that for 99% of the folks on this call, this is very unlikely that it's something that you want to do. So I want to call it out for specifically that reason. However, what we can see is still a consistent trend across all of these case studies is that we have to still use human in the loop for complex migrations. And I particularly like what Google call out in this one is they talk about their toolkit also aims to assist engineers and let them focus on complex aspects, but without isolating them from the process. So one common aspect across these case studies and even from our own customers is that it helps to also, when you're passing off this migration code to those that are then responsible for reviewing it, that you also share the process that the agent took. There's many different ways of doing this. One is instructing the agent to commit using commit history that explains it. Another is purely documentation. Another is exposing the developers themselves to the chat context that the agent went through. A number of different ways, but we have to think about that because we can also add a lot of complexity if we're just giving developers a pull request and saying, hey, this is now complete without exposing them to the process that was taken to get there. So if I come back to my previous categories here, I think for the vast majority of the industry, the opportunity here lies in these hybrid types of migrations that combine deterministic workflows and scripts with more autonomous agents. There are black box migrations that might be relevant for legacy types of organizations, but that will still take a lot of setup. You're going to have to go through a lot of human intervention in order to do that. And the AST-based migrations still work, but can work a lot better when done in combination also with agents themselves. I mentioned this briefly, and I think it's important enough that it's worth talking about specifically. But when it comes to migrations, especially with agents, we can break these down really into two different categories. One is local and one is scaled migrations. Local migrations, effectively, you're running the scripts, the agents themselves on your machine. As a platform team member, if you're running this on behalf of other engineers, that might mean then cloning down that repository locally, setting everything up, running the agent on your machine, waiting until that's done, etc. A scale migration, though, is where we have some form of tool that can do this at scale, where we're running all of those agents in parallel. That obviously means we need some form of orchestration. It means we need to isolate these environments separately. We need some way to scale them horizontally to meet that need. So what effectively the local version of this is a great way to get started. It's a great way to test feasibility for a use case to see, let's say if we have a migration, we want to go from Python 2 to Python 3. And we want to understand how well is that going to work for our code base. Running that with a local migration could be a great way to test that out and understand that feasibility. But then if we want to start rolling it out at scale at a large organization, or we want to repeat the process of running these migrations, having access to a tool that can scale that across hundreds or even thousands of repositories is something that we will also then want to look into. And that, of course, is what Ona can do. Now, one key learning from looking across the different use cases is the impact of human in the loop, which I've already mentioned. But what I want to show here is, on the right-hand side, is that when we take those different phases, the investigation phase of a migration, what are the changes, what methods are changing, we then have to enact that change, and then we have to test and verify. When it comes to migrations, especially with agents, what we're going to see is the investigation will be shorter. The agents, once we have our context and our prompts, they can just take that and they can re-execute that on a new piece of source code straight away. So that investigation phase is going to shrink. The development phase certainly shrinks as well. As we all know, the best thing that agents are good at doing today is writing code. However, what that does mean is that there is still a shift in burden then to testing and verification. So there's an opportunity to save time in those migrations, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the testing and verification side of this is going to get shorter. It may even get slightly longer, as we now then, when we hand this over to developers, then they have to understand and sift through the agent generated code and check for those edge cases, which oftentimes are the most complicated ones. And at this point, I would like to stress, because I see this sometimes, is that there is no form of migration that I am seeing that is of any significant complexity that can be done without a human in the loop and can be done on repositories that are effectively abandoned. What I mean to say that is every use case requires the change to be put into a repository where there are active code owners who understand the repository, who understand the code base, and can then review effectively that change. What we haven't solved as an industry today is making migrations onto unknown code bases without any form of verification. That doesn't exist, at least not that I've ever seen, and I don't think it will exist in the short-term future, certainly not. What we need to make sure is that we are making migrations on top of code bases that are at least well understood by the developers. Okay, so final slide before I actually wrap up is I want to talk about when do we invest in this? Which types of companies does this make sense for doing these sort of agent migrations? One factor is certainly whether you want to do this with local or orchestrated agents. If you do this with local agents, the cost barrier can be quite low, and you can certainly do this today, which means downloading your favorite agent, starting to explore some of those prompts in that context, and then building up your migration on your machine, building up setup scripts. If you want to, you can even go back, and I think Airbnb specifically also open sourced their exact implementation. So if you wanted to take inspiration from that, you certainly could. Then obviously, if that is successful for you, then you might want to look at this orchestration of your agents. So if we take a look at this graph on the right-hand side, and we see on the x-axis we have scale. So we have the number of engineers in our organization, or the size of our organization. Obviously, for small organizations, migrations just don't make sense. Or large-scale migrations, we may as well just do this as individual teams. There's no point trying to build repetitive nature into this. But there does come a point around about 10 teams, 100 to 500 engineers, which is actually interesting in the same number we see for platform teams. When it's the time to invest in internal enablement teams, it's also the time that we want to start thinking about centralizing some of these migrations. If we look then up the y-axis as well, then what we've got is the intersection of our cost. So creating the migration itself, building the prompts, building the context, and iterating on that feedback is not free. There is a variable cost to that. So the more repositories, the more source code, the more edge cases, and therefore we're going to see an increasing cost for the amount of different teams and repositories we build into a migration. And then we have to factor into that, if we are setting up an orchestration system, that there will be a cost to set that up in the first place, and we have to add that on. And then we're going to see break even. Typically, like I say, this starts to happen around 100 to 500 engineers. It depends on the type of migration that you're doing. If you're a company of smaller than that size, I probably would stay away from this. If you're a company of larger than that size, then looking into this certainly would make sense for agents and agent-based migrations. Now, quickly, just to wrap up, because I've gone through quite a lot in there, is that these large-scale migrations are feasible today. If we look at those different case studies we ran through, they are working. There is nothing specific about, I know I chose these big names, Airbnb and Slack, but the tools that they're using weren't unavailable to the general population today. Google training their own models is a little bit more advanced, but exactly what Slack and Airbnb are doing is available to organizations, for free today with open source tooling. What does that mean for consulting, to come back to the original title, is I think what we will see is consultants will shift to this more like black box migrations, where there's a heavy amount of sort of white glove and human in the loop that's required. And I think we'll start to see these hybrid migrations then shift in-house, and organizations will start to build up their capability to run these large scale migrations, just as we do with something like a CI tool. You join a company or organization today, we expect there to be version control, we expect there to be continuous integration, maybe some aspects of observability or deployment might need some improvement, but there are some staples. And I do believe that what we'll see in the future is all organizations having this ability to enact code changes across their estate. By doing so automatically will become much more commonplace. But a few key points when you look at the different case studies, and we look even at our customers as well, migrations do require human in the loop. You need a human reviewer to review them. There's not a version of migrations that exists today where that's not possible. We want to focus on getting to 80% success. It doesn't make sense to try and get these migrations to 100%. We just have to accept that that long tail, those last few final yards, will have to be done by human reviewers. It is not necessarily something that we can automate every step of the way, but doing 80% success can be significant ROI and can save us significant time. We don't want to isolate engineers from the process. If we can expose them to how the migration has happened, that helps speed up that review process and stops that from inflating and actually eating into our ROI by creating a longer review cycle. And these hybrid migrations where we're blending agents with scripts that are deterministic and also agentic and autonomous is where the opportunity exists for most organizations today. So I've dropped in a couple of links here as well. If you want to, if you go to ona.com/cases and automations, there's a specific page that talks about this large scale automation capability within Ona, but it's quite new, so that page will continue to be built out. So if you do actually just want a demo and want to see how this works in practice, we're very happy to give you that. If you want to also reach out to me in particular, I'm very happy to also chat about that, and then we can actually show you how this looks in practice and talk you through a lot more case studies and things like that as well. But otherwise, that is pretty much it. So what I will do is I will ask Maria if she is here, if we do have any questions, to jump through those.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lou. It was super interesting content. Like I didn't know that you guys did so much research overall on agents. Truly enjoyed it. So guys, everybody else, I already see there are some questions in the Q&A chat, but if you have more, please don't be shy and drop in more questions there. We still have 15 minutes or so to go over those. So the first question, how do AI agents influence decision-making in large-scale data platform migrations, especially in environments where multiple migrations and remigrations are common? Could you share specific use cases where they have demonstrably reduced risk or accelerated ROI?
There was one word in there, sorry, Maria. You said almost like a certain type of migration. I didn't quite catch that.
Data platform migrations.
Okay. So I don't think data platform migrations necessarily is so much different than what we went through. There wasn't like sort of a data or ETL specific example. It's interesting to me because even in the question with regards to the risk side of it, this is why I mentioned that there is this big caveat of we still need human in the loop to review this, and we can take this to a certain percentage, but there still needs to be humans that review it on the other side. In terms of ROI, well, it depends on the migration. So if I just briefly if I go back here, that's the thing. There is this sort of base cost that goes into building out that migration. It's the same with any type of automation. The best way of doing this, to be honest, is actually just benchmarking. So if you have like the migration, like we take one of the Airbnb examples, this Enzyme one, you can just take one repository, go through that, and then from that you can just simply extrapolate. So how long did that take you to go through it and to do the migration? That gives you a cost of effectively doing this manually. Then what you can do is then start to have a go and start to explore doing this with your agent as well. Start to see how quickly you can get that to a certain degree. Obviously, that's the thing. If this scale axis on the X here like goes further, if you have more and more engineers, more and more teams, obviously automating that is going to make more and more sense. But spending more and more time trying to get the migration right might not make sense. The companies that we tend to work with are sort of 500 engineers plus. You typically find in that level of scale, the migration effort of like scripting this becomes significantly worth it, because just even trying to explain, get in contact with, trying to get prioritized within that team's backlog to understand the migration and actually do it is very difficult. If you can raise that PR that's 80% done, you can significantly reduce the timelines. Most of these types of migrations in a lot of organizations will be measured in months, if not in years, because you want to fit that around existing roadmaps. So therefore, if you can execute these, it really then comes down to, as a platform team, how fast you can support them as well. So once you're raising those pull requests, you might get ad hoc questions. You'll probably get support requests about those migrations themselves. If you can fold as much of that feedback back into subsequent migrations for future projects on different teams, great. But yeah, it's one of those questions where it depends. my best advice is to do it manually on single repositories to get a baseline for the cost, and then you can extrapolate from there about how much time you're potentially saving the other teams. The one final thing I would say is some good metrics to look at is things like time to merge PR. So when you raise these migrations, how long and how fast does it take you to merge that PR? How many commits does it take typically? Once you raise it, does that team have to add 10 commits on top to change it, or is it one small commit? And how fast do they get that merged in? And that can give you a good idea of how well that migration is actually going. And then from there, you can make a decision about whether or not you scale that migration out, or whether you decide that it would be easier to do manually or even not at all, which is the case in some cases.
Makes sense. Thank you, Lou. Next question. Obviously, if upgrading front-end code, there is not that many security implications, but how does one, in case of large backend migration, ensure that there will not be any security issues in the migrated code, especially if there is thousands of changes in file? I think you actually talked a little bit about this. No.
Yeah, I will find myself repeating myself because we do have to set expectations of what is possible, right? Again, this is why the humans have to review it. One thing that I would say that as a pattern that works well here is what I've come to call almost antagonistic agents or antagonistic prompting, because we know that AI itself is very sycophantic. It wants to please us. It wants to do its best. Can lead to some very peculiar behavior sometimes, like it cutting corners, literally skipping tests or commenting them out. What helps to do there is when you have these sequential migrations is to have steps in there that validate against that, which is almost acting antagonistically, whereby one agent is instructed to do the migration, and then your second prompt or your second agent is then instructed to then critique that as you go. In terms of the security side, there isn't a silver bullet. These still need to be reviewed. As you say, there's still a lot of changes. I think that's why, if I slide back in my slide sheet, so this statement from Google about like not isolating engineers from the process is the important part. That you have to showcase what steps have been taken by the agent in order to get to that point, so that they can be effectively reviewed, and aspects like security come into that. But this is where also, I think, depending on the size of the migration, if you could make those changes smaller, if you could make that review simpler, that's going to help. But there isn't fundamentally a silver bullet that's going to protect you, let's say, from specific security vulnerabilities other than effective review, which is the same as it is today. What we're getting is we're getting to that 80% faster, but it doesn't mean that we can skip that final 20% of review either. But it's a very good question.
Yeah. As with everything in life, there's no silver bullet for anything.
Sadly not.
Cool.
Sadly not.
Sadly not. So pessimistic. No, but we'll get there hopefully one day. Which tools are you using for AST part of the hybrid migrations? Code mods, open rewrite, or something else?
It doesn't matter. I'm not actually sure in the particular case of was it Airbnb or Slack? I keep getting those mixed up in my brain. The one that used the AST. I don't think they mention. You could have a look actually in their write-up if they do mention which AST library they're using. Obviously, like Open Rewrite is very popular, but I'm not actually sure in their specific use case. With our customers, it's a range and it differs. Like I say, Open Rewrite comes up a lot and seems to be very popular, but it depends on your use case, depends what your preferences and what works for you. And obviously, different libraries have different compatibilities and different modules with different languages. Like Open Rewrite is very Java focused. I'm sure that there are others that are built a little bit better for other languages, etc. So it kind of just depends.
Makes sense. Is there other ways to migrate legacy code by using AI agent to produce specs documentation by reverse engineering and then AI agents to generate new code from specs?
Yeah. I don't know when these questions got dropped. It depends on the time. What I would say is that's this sort of like black box type of migration that I talk about here. What I would suggest is if that's something that you're interested in, I would say go and have a look at what like Mechanical Orchard is doing. They don't publish a lot exactly about the ins and outs. I'm sure, you know, obviously they want to keep their special sauce a little bit close, but this is what they're trying to get to is, you know, these sort of spec driven migrations by going to the spec and then rewriting services like that. They do have a bunch of use cases that talk about it, including this exact one, which you can go and have a look at if you would like to. But going back to what I said before is there's a lot of human intervention in here, because let's say when you have those legacy systems, all of your inputs are like going through all the documentation, understanding everything about that service to create those specifications. Those specifications still need reviewing. And then when you end up with your service, you're not doing a like for like migration. Therefore, you're getting effectively like a whole new service, which then also needs to be tested. And then ideally is very small because you want to put that into production incrementally. But just like if you are outsourcing this to humans, you would also want to make sure that this is very thoroughly tested as well when it comes out of the other side. So it's a different approach for a different risk appetite and for a different type of migration. This is really something I would only suggest if you're in a position where you really just don't understand and you really need to modernize a code base where you don't have reviewers for it, because the less risky option certainly would be to do this in small incremental pieces. But obviously in the case of something like COBOL, you're not trying to refactor COBOL, you're trying to rewrite it, you're trying to get it back into some modern language so you can build on top of it, in which case you have no choice. In which case I would say go and have a look at what the likes of Mechanical Orchard and similar are doing, because it might give some inspiration about how to do that yourself. Principally what I'd say is the agents are speeding up the process, but in this case they're not necessarily revolutionizing it, because a lot of those steps, or a lot of the manual steps still need to be done. They're just sped up via the agent or via AI.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Cool. I think we are on time. If there is one more questions, one more last question, maybe we can take it. If not, thank you so much, Lou, and thank you so much to everyone who joined us this evening or this morning, to our North American colleagues. We'll send over the slides and the recording to everyone who registered. And if you have any other questions, of course, you can find Lou on Platform Engineering Slack and just ask directly. With that, thank you so much, and good night, everyone. Have a nice rest of the week, and see you, I don't know, at AWS reInvent. Are you coming, Lou? No.
Yes, I'll be there.
Oh, okay. Wow. It's probably gonna
Yes,
be.
find me at reInvent if you're at reInvent.
Oh my God. No, I'm not signing up for that. Sorry. Cool. Thank you, and have a good night. Bye.